All right. In our last discussion, we followed the brutal story of how a free proletariat was created. People literally forced off their land and then whipped into the wage labor system by some pretty horrific laws. But this leaves a huge question hanging in the air, a question that really gets us to the heart of how capital itself begins to form. So you have this massive new class of landless workers. Who's going to hire them? Now, the story of the industrial capitalist, the factory owner, that's a bit more complex, and we'll get to it later. First, we've got to understand their counterpart out in the country. And as Marx shows us in chapter 29, the rise of a whole new kind of farmer is absolutely essential to this entire story of primitive accumulation. You see, the capitalist farmer didn't just appear out of nowhere. There was this long, slow evolution of relationships on the land. Marx walks us through a few key predecessors, and each one is a small step away from that old feudal system. Okay, so the earliest version is the bailiff. And the most important thing to get here is that the bailiff was still a serf himself. Yeah, he managed the lord's estate, the domain, but he was directing labor that was compulsory. It wasn't free. He had no capital of his own. His position depended entirely on the lord. So he's a manager for sure, but he is not a capitalist. Then you get a really big step forward with a métayer, or what we'd call a sharecropper. This person is no longer a serf. They contribute their own labor. But, and this is the key, they're not a capitalist yet, because the landlord is still the one providing all the essential capital, the seeds, the animals, the tools. They work the land, and then they split the final harvest with the landlord, based on a contract. The farmer is still fundamentally dependent on the landlord's capital. And that brings us to the real turning point. Over in England, around the end of the 15th century and rolling into the 16th, this sharecropper system gets pushed aside pretty fast by a farmer of a totally new type. This is the guy who will become the true capitalist farmer. The difference is, well, it's night and day. The métayer, he just brought his labor to the table. This new farmer brings his own capital. He owns the tools, the seed, the livestock, the whole shebang. And he uses that capital to employ the new landless proletariat as wage laborers. So he's not just managing his own work anymore, he is now managing and, crucially, exploiting the labor of other people to make a profit. That's the leap, that's the switch to capitalist production right there. Marx has this line that just nails it. The capitalist farmer got rich from two directions at the same time. On one hand, he profited by paying his workers a wage that was worth less than the value they were actually creating, and on the other hand, as we're about to see, he also profited massively from his rental agreement with the landlord, thanks to some very unique historical circumstances. So, the big question is, how did this new class of farmers get so wealthy so quickly? Well, Marx points to this kind of perfect storm of economic factors in the 16th century that created a gigantic windfall for them. It was, in effect, a massive, unintentional transfer of wealth right into their pockets. Just look at how all this lines up. First, these farmers lock in really long leases. We're talking up to 99 years, with their rent payments fixed at the old value of money. Then, boom, the price revolution hits. All this gold and silver coming in from the Americas makes money worth a lot less. So what happens? The price of everything the farmer sells, wool, grain, meat, goes through the roof. But his two biggest costs, his rent and his workers' wages, were either stuck in the past or being actively pushed down by the government. Let's just break it down. It's a simple 4-step recipe for massive profits. Step 1, your rent is fixed by a long-term contract. Step 2, massive inflation means the money you use to pay that rent is worth way less. Step 3, you sell everything you produce at the new incredibly high market prices. And step 4, at the exact same time, the government is helping you suppress the real value of the wages you have to pay out. The gap between your costs and your revenue just explodes. You can really see it here. The farmer's costs, his rent and wages, are staying low or even shrinking in real value. Meanwhile, his revenue from selling his products is just skyrocketing. That giant widening gap between the two lines, that's his profit. That is the wealth that got turned into capital. This historical windfall is what really cemented the capitalist farmer as a new powerful force in England. So when the dust settles on all this, on the enclosures, the expropriation, and this agricultural revolution, what you have is a completely new kind of society, a new economic order, out there in the English countryside. Marx calls this new setup the trinity of capitalist agriculture. And it's pretty straightforward. You've got the landlord, who now just sits back and collects a check for rent. You've got the capitalist farmer, who's running the show, managing production and chasing profit. And you've got the propertyless wage laborer, who now has nothing to sell but their ability to work in exchange for a wage. This three-part structure is the very foundation of the capitalist mode of production.
Okay, so why is this so critical for what happens next, for the rise of industry? Well, think about it. By destroying the old system where peasants grew their own food and made their own clothes, this revolution created a massive domestic market. All these new wage laborers, they can't make their own stuff anymore. They have to buy everything: food, clothes, tools. Their wages become the very revenue stream that's going to fuel the rise of the industrial capitalists.
So the key takeaway here is that kicking the agricultural population off the land did two things at once. It freed up a workforce for industry, and it created the market for the goods that industry was about to produce. The farm has basically become a factory, and the countryside is now the market. The stage is set. So the next question we have to ask, and the one we'll get into in Chapter 30, is what happens when this agricultural revolution starts to feed back into industry itself?